Welcome once again to the Rural Policy Learning Commons webinar series. Today our topic will be Entrepreneur and Investor Immigration in Canada. This session should take about 30 to 45 minutes. After the presentation, there is going to be a question and answer session where you can forward your questions to the presenter. Please type your questions in the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. You can also type technical questions into the chat box. This session will be recorded and posted on our RPLC YouTube channel, where it will be available for viewing. Following the presentation, we will send the links of the video and the slides and the short survey to our participants. Please take your time to complete the survey. Just some housekeeping matters about our technology that we're using. Zoom is a web-based platform. Interruptions may occur due to the strength of your service. If interruptions occurs, visit Zoom US website and use the login ID to join us again. Just to get into our presentation, today I outlined our topic, Entrepreneur and Investor Immigration in Canada. Just a brief introduction on the topic, and then we'll hand over to our presenter. People are drawn to Canada due to the excellent economic prospects. Aggressive recruitment by the Canadian government is believed to help with immigration. These recruitment initiatives are broken down into different categories. Example, entrepreneur and investor, which will be our main topic of discussion for today. The Rural Development Institute has carried out numerous research studies on immigration. Some of our noted researchers, Bill Ashton and Associates, who focused on immigration in 5 rural Manitoba communities with a focus on refugees. There are also Alison Moss and Monica Sormora, who focused on immigration, migration, opportunities and challenges in Brandon, Manitoba. Marian Batty, Rural Immigration, Welcoming, Settling and Retaining. You're welcome to visit the Rural Development Institute website, where you will find a selection of research done on immigration. Just a little about our presenter. Today's presenter, Kareem El Assal, is an Immigration and Education Research Associate with the Conference Board of Canada. His concentration is in permanent resident selection, settlement and integration, temporary foreign work programs, intergovernmental relations, and entrepreneur investor groups. He's a graduate of the University of Toronto and Durham University. Now we are going to get into our presentation. I will now turn over to Kareem, where he will get into our topic for today.
So good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining me today. I would like to first off thank Monique for that introduction, and I would like to thank the Rural Development Institute for inviting me to deliver this talk today. So I am going to talk, of course, about entrepreneur and investor immigration. I'll give you a brief overview of the opportunities that are in front of us, why this is an important topic. Before that, I'll give you a quick background about myself. Then we'll look at the Canadian and international context. We'll discuss a few policy options, and then we'll have about 15 minutes or so at the end for questions. So about myself, I'm based in Ottawa. I'm originally from Toronto. I joined the conference board just over 2.5 years ago, and I'm very fortunate to be able to cover many different immigration areas, as Monique outlined, including permanent resident selection, temporary foreign workers, international students, and of course, business immigration. And I became very interested in business immigration when I joined the conference board in October 2014, because as some of you may recall, that month, the Migration Policy Institute, a major immigration think tank based in Washington, D.C., released a great report called Selling Visas and Citizenship. And that report provided a great overview of the business immigration climate around the world. And so ever since, I've been very fascinated by the topic, and I've done a few initiatives of my own at the conference board on this issue, including 2 webinars, which I organized back in 2015. And we covered this subject at our annual immigration conference last April in Ottawa. And then we decided, hey, why not host our own Entrepreneur and Investor Immigration Summit, which we did. It was Canada's first ever event on this topic. This past December, we did it in Toronto. We had over 200 delegates, including several former federal immigration ministers. And following that event, we released a report, which is now available on our website. It's free to download, and the hyperlink is on your screen. And so I'm going to base my presentation today on the key issues that are outlined in this report. So first things first, let's look at the opportunity that's in front of us. So Canada has had business immigration programs since 1978, but we've had various challenges along the way, and I'm going to go over the challenges throughout this presentation. And so there's two schools of thought in Canada today. One is the minority view, which is that Canada shouldn't spend too much time on business immigration because of all the challenges we've had over the past 40 years. And rather than operating entrepreneur and investor programs, we should just focus on skilled worker programs in which we seek individuals with high human capital who may either decide to work in the labor market or to start their own businesses as entrepreneurs. But in terms of having dedicated programs for this area, some feel, and this is again a minority view, that Canada shouldn't spend too much time on it. Then you have the majority view, which is evidenced by the fact that the federal government and most provinces and territories in Canada operate business immigration programs. And that view is that we should continue to engage in the field, and we should continue to engage in trial and error in search of the right formula. And that's the prism that I'm going to use throughout this presentation, that business immigration is very beneficial to Canada, and we need to continue to work together through dialogue and research to identify the best path forward. So when we step back and look at government party areas in Canada today in order to boost our economic potential, we see that there's a very close alignment between what governments are looking to achieve and the benefits of business immigration. So Canada is looking to bring in at least 300,000 immigrants per year moving forward. That was the base level that was announced by the federal government last October. Canada, of course, is looking to attract foreign direct investment. So, for instance, the federal government launched an Invest in Canada hub this past fall, and they made an initial commitment of $218 million to get it off the ground. Of course, Canada is looking to become more innovative. Federal and provincial governments support SMEs with high growth potential, and at the federal level, we have a venture capital action plan. Governments are always looking to build infrastructure, and we've seen a huge commitment by the federal government towards a Canada Infrastructure Bank, as well as provinces and territories who are making commitments of their own that are in the billions of dollars. And then affordable housing is another key priority. So the federal government recently committed $11.2 billion to developing affordable housing. It's certainly a major issue in places such as Toronto and Vancouver. So when we look at these priorities and we realize that Canada is looking to bring in immigrants, we have more business immigrants globally than ever before. Business immigrants want to come to Canada, and business immigrants can support these economic development priorities. We see that we have a tremendous opportunity, and I like to refer to it as a match made in heaven. So it's really up to us as Canadians to identify how we can benefit from business immigration as much as possible. Then we look at business immigrants at a micro level. We realize that they have various components within their human, social, and financial capital that can benefit our economy. And so the human and social capital that business immigrants have can help us launch more innovative businesses that compete on a global scale. Business immigrants can help to succeed aging and retiring Canadian SME owners who are looking to find successors to their Canadian enterprises. And business immigrants can help us foster stronger business and trade connections with the rest of the world. And it's important to note that oftentimes an entrepreneur in Canada faces many challenges, and business immigrants face even more challenges because they have to deal with the typical challenges that any immigrant in Canada faces: learning a new language, being acclimated to a new environment, making new friends, making new contacts. And so regardless of whether a business immigrant does succeed in Canada as an entrepreneur, oftentimes they have high human and social capital and financial capital. And so they're going to land on their feet and do well in our country, regardless of whether they succeed as an entrepreneur. Then when we look at high net worth immigrants, and these are typically the folks that qualify for investor immigration, the money that they provide to Canada's governments can help support key economic development priority areas such as infrastructure, affordable housing, and SME supports. And also because they have a lot of money, they are significant consumers of goods and services in Canada. So they buy houses, cars, they send their kids to university and college. And so because they're significant consumers, this has a positive benefit on our economy. So that's the short answer to why this is a useful topic for us to discuss over the next hour or so. Now let's take a look at the Canadian context, and then we'll look at the international context, and following that we'll have a better understanding of the challenges, and then we can go into the policy options section at the end. So Canada has three classes of business immigrants: entrepreneur, self-employed, and investor. So the entrepreneur class obviously is selected on the basis and the expectation that they're going to come to Canada and launch a business here, which is going to create jobs for Canadians. And so the selection criteria is obviously based on their business background, their business plan that they're going to pursue in Canada, their net worth to ensure that they have enough money to first of all launch their business in Canada, and then secondly have enough money to sustain themselves and their families while here, and then other human capital factors such as their language skills, their age, their education, etc. Then you have the self-employed class, which is very, very niche, and they're selected only on the basis that they're going to employ themselves in Canada. Again, this is a very, very small category. It's aimed at artists and people in the culture sector, athletes, etc. So it's very, very small. And the selection criteria is similar to the entrepreneur class. And then you have the next major class of business immigrants, which is investor immigrants. And they're selected solely on the basis that they're going to provide a refundable loan to the Canadian government, which the government will use for economic development over a period of 5 years. After 5 years, the investor will get their full loan amount back without any interest. And so the interesting thing about the investor class is that despite the fact there is no expectation that the investor is going to start a business in Canada or even work or earn any money in Canada, the selection criteria is still very similar to the entrepreneur and self-employed classes. Canada looks at an individual's human capital, their business experience, etc., even though the investor, again, is not expected to start a business in our country. So those are the three classes. Now let's quickly review the history of business immigration in Canada. So I said at the beginning that Canada has been engaged in business immigration for about 40 years. Well, in 1978, a new Immigration Act took effect in Canada, and with it came new immigration regulations. And so they defined these two business immigration classes up on your screen, the entrepreneur class and the self-employed class. Also in 1978, the federal government signed a new bilateral agreement with the province of Quebec called the Cullen-Couture Agreement, and in it, Quebec gained control of selecting all economic class immigrants to its province, and it's had that control ever since. It's the only province in Canada with such authority. And so the following year, in 1979, Quebec launched its own entrepreneur and self-employed programs. Then in 1986, Canada became the second country on the planet to launch an immigrant investor program. The first was the Caribbean island nation of the St. Kitts and Nevis. And later that year, in 1986, Quebec launched its own immigrant investor program. And just to give you a sense of what to expect later in this presentation, the Federal Immigrant Investor Program, the IIP for short, was canceled in 2014 because the federal government was not happy with its economic development results, while Quebec's program continues to operate and is the only immigrant investor program that's in Canada today. Then in the 1990s and 2000s, we saw the federal government devolve immigrant selection responsibilities to the provinces and territories. Immigration is of course an area of shared jurisdiction in Canada, but it was only in the 1990s and 2000s that the rest of the provinces and territories became more involved in not only selecting immigrants, but also settling and integrating them. And so what we saw, beginning with, of course, Manitoba, was the provincial nominee program launched officially in 1998 as a permanent program. It started in Manitoba and Saskatchewan. And every province and territory since has had their own provincial nominee program initiated, except Quebec, which again, since 1978 has had control, and none of it which doesn't select any economic class immigrants. And so under the PNPs, we've seen almost every province and territory in Canada launch their own entrepreneur and self-employed streams for immigrants. Then in 2011, the federal government announced it was pausing its entrepreneur program, which again launched in 1978. And in 2012, it paused the Immigrant Investor Program, which launched in 1986. In 2013, it launched the Startup Visa Pilot Program. I'll talk more about this throughout my presentation. But essentially, under ministerial instructions, the federal government is able to launch an economic class pilot program for up to 5 years. During that 5-year period, they can review whether to make it permanent. And then after 5 years, they have to enshrine it into federal immigration law, and the program thereby becomes permanent. So we're going to find out by this coming April 2018 whether they will decide to make it a permanent program. In 2014, the federal government, after reviewing the entrepreneur program and immigrant investor program, it decided to cancel both of them because it was dissatisfied with the economic development results. And I'll talk more about the immigrant investor program and why it was canceled later in this presentation. So here we are today in 2017, and this is the lay of the land in Canada. At the federal level, we have the Startup Visa Pilot Program and the Self-Employed Program, which has been around since '78. Then in Quebec, we have the 3 classes that have existed in the province since '79 and '86. And most of Canada's provinces and territories have their own entrepreneur and or self-employed streams, and New Brunswick is set to rejoin this club very, very soon. So just to give you a sense of the selection criteria for business immigration programs, here is what it looks like for previous and current federal programs. And even though this is just for federal programs, it's important to note and to realize that the criteria is actually very similar for provincial programs as well. So let's look at the entrepreneur program at the top of your screen, which again was terminated in 2014. Typically speaking, the government in Canada, provincial government, will look at an individual's business experience. They're often required to be at the highest level within their organization or to have started a business themselves. And typically, Canada looks for at least 2 years of business experience, but this can be sometimes 3 years. And so once an individual proves that, then the government looks at other criteria, such as the individual's minimum net worth. It's in the hundreds of thousands, again, to ensure that the person can afford to start a business in Canada and they can afford to sustain themselves and their families while in our country. The expectation is, of course, that they're going to actively manage a business in Canada. And with regard to visa status, this is a very, very important thing to realize. Oftentimes, an immigrant entrepreneur is admitted to Canada on a temporary visa, or they gain conditional permanent residence. And so what this means is that they're required to prove themselves in Canada, to prove that A, they launched the business, B, it's still in operations, and C, they've employed a minimum number of people. And the minimum number is usually set out in contracts between the provincial government and the immigrant. And once the individual proves that, then they qualify for permanent residence status. So all of the risk is assumed by the immigrant entrepreneur. Then with the Immigrant Investor Program, the Quebec program is very similar to what you see on your screens. The federal government and Quebec since 2010 have required that an immigrant investor make an $800,000 loan to the government and have a minimum net worth of at least $1.6 million. Again, they're required to have business experience, even though they're not asked to launch a business in Canada. And unlike the entrepreneur program, immigrant investors get unconditional permanent residence. So once they provide the loan to the government, they're able to gain permanent residence and remain in Canada indefinitely. Now, if we go to the bottom and look at the Startup Visa program, this is the one that was launched as a pilot in April 2013. And again, the government will decide by next year whether to make it permanent. It's a very interesting program. We'll talk more about it momentarily. An individual needs to demonstrate business acumen to secure backing from a designated Canadian organization. So the federal government has designated a number of venture capital fund organizations or angel investor groups or business incubator groups across Canada. One of these three groups then identifies a prospective immigrant entrepreneur. They meet, they talk about the entrepreneur's business plan and viability of the plan within Canada. If the designated organization likes them, they'll provide them with a letter of support. The potential immigrant entrepreneur will then take the letter of support to the federal government. The federal government will review it and decide whether to confer unconditional permanent residence status or not. So again, we'll look more into this program later in this presentation. So here's the data of business immigrant arrivals to Canada since 1980. This only looks at federal and provincial, federal and Quebec data, because again, they've been operating the program since day one. So we see that in the early days, in the early 1980s, Canada's business immigrant intake was very low until it shot up in the late 1980s, and that's when Canada began to take in immigrant investors. Then Canada saw a peak of business immigrant arrivals in the early 1990s when they accounted for over 30,000 immigrants to Canada per year, which was just over 30% of all of Canada's economic class immigrants selected during that period. Then Canada's business immigrant intake began to decline, and I would attribute this to government policy priorities. They began to focus more on the skilled worker class. And so here we are today with 2015 data in front of us. I've seen the 2016 data and it's very similar. Canada's business immigrant intake is very low. It's roughly around 5,000 to 6,000 immigrants per year, which makes up less than 5% of all of economic class immigrants to Canada each year. So here's the interesting thing. As Canada's intake of business immigrants has declined, we've seen the intake of business immigrants around the world increase. So this is just a snapshot of immigrant investor programs that have been launched since 1984. Not all of these programs continue to operate, and this list isn't exhaustive. I've seen estimates that have said up to 60 countries in the world operate business immigration programs. It's really hard to put a finger on it. I will say with confidence there are more than 30 countries that operate business immigration programs. But anyways, here's a snapshot of investor immigration programs in the world. So we see that prior to 2008, there were only about 10 countries or so that had immigrant investor programs. Again, Canada was the second country ever to launch one. And then since 2008, if you look at the second half of this table, you see way more countries engaged in the field of immigrant investor programs. And the main reason for that is, against the backdrop of the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009, countries began to see immigrant investor programs as a great way to raise capital. And so that's why we've seen more and more of these programs. Another reason why we've seen more of these programs is because there's more wealth around the world. So if we look at the number of people in the world that have at least 100,000 US dollars, the population is 377 million people. But if we focus on the high net worth population, these are the folks, high net worth and above, these are the folks that qualify usually for immigrant investor programs. We see that there are over 16 million individuals in the world that have at least 1 million US dollars. And if we look at the recent data, we see that more high net worth individuals are immigrating around the world. In 2016, 82,000 millionaires immigrated, compared with 64,000 millionaires that immigrated in 2015. And so here are the main motives as to why there are more business immigrants looking to leave their home countries, and also why there's more business immigration programs globally. So just like anyone else, business immigrants are looking for stability and looking for a good quality of life. And so they look at entrepreneur investor immigration programs as a way to gain more insurance and safety in case things go awry politically or economically in their home country. And I'll give you an example of this in the Canadian context. In the 1980s and 1990s, Canada saw more Hong Kong nationals arrive under business immigration streams. And the reason for that is that they were looking for more certainty because they didn't know what to expect when Hong Kong's sovereignty would be transferred back to China from the UK in 1997. So because they didn't know what to expect in the years leading up to the transfer back to China, they looked abroad, and many of them arrived to Canada under the business class. Business immigrants are also looking for a return on their investment. This isn't always the case. Sometimes they're motivated, or oftentimes they're motivated just by immigration. But you do have entrepreneurs, for example, who are looking to make money elsewhere. If you're a high net worth individual, you pay a lot of tax. And so just like all of us, you're always looking to reduce your tax burden as much and as legally as possible. And so they oftentimes will look to business immigration programs in countries with lower taxes than their home country. Another motive for business immigration is that it's a way to bypass regular immigration channels. So, in Canada, we've long had a challenge with backlogs because of huge demand of those who want to move to our great country. And so sometimes individuals have waited years and years, up to 8 or 9 years under the old federal skilled worker program. And so business immigration has been seen as a means to avoid these backlogs. That hasn't been the case necessarily in Canada because our business immigration processing remains slow because of the due diligence requirements that are undertaken by government. So in Canada, it can take 5 or 6 years for a business immigrant to get their application processed. But in other countries, applications are processed very, very quickly. In some countries, they'll be reviewed within a week or so of submitting an application, and a final decision will be made within a couple of months. And so that's one of the appeals of business immigration programs globally. And then another benefit and another motive of business immigration is getting a passport that allows you to travel to many countries visa-free. So many business immigrants come from countries where traveling to other parts of the world can be a bit onerous because their passport isn't very strong, compared with a Canadian passport, which allows you to travel visa-free to, I believe, 172 countries, or gaining a passport from the US, Europe, or a Commonwealth nation in the Caribbean, which allows you to go to many countries, 150 plus countries, without requiring a visa. So again, that's one of the motives for qualifying or applying for a business immigration program. But despite these motives, we have to pause and remember that Canada's immigration system isn't driven by the needs of those externally, but rather driven by our country's needs. So regardless of what business immigrants are looking for, we have to ensure there's a good match between what Canada wants and what they want. And we have to ensure that it's in our interests to admit business immigrants. And so because of the disconnect between the old federal immigrant investor program and what the government wanted and what immigrant investors wanted, the federal government decided again in 2014 to cancel that long-standing program. So the government's objectives, I would say, evolved over time. They wanted immigrant investors who would not only provide a loan to Canada, but also settle in our country, work, maybe start a business, invest in our economy, and pay taxes. Whereas immigrant investors, they're very wealthy people. They've already made their wealth, and they don't need to earn another dime to support their high quality of life. And so many of them arrive to Canada just looking for stability or to send their kids off to university or college. And so there was little incentive or little requirement for them to make money in our country. And so because of this disconnect, the federal government canceled the program. But nevertheless, we have to remember, in light of our economic development priorities, including attracting high-skilled immigrants who are able to support job creation in our country, business immigration can help benefit us. And so the billion-dollar question, because there are billions of dollars on the line here, is how can we do business immigration right? So before we look at policy options, let's step back for a second and understand why business immigration has been such a challenge for Canada for the past 40 years. Well, we need to keep in mind that entrepreneurship is very difficult, whether you're a Canadian-born individual or an immigrant. So Industry Canada produced a report back in 2010 that found that 30% of Canadian-owned SMEs survive 2 years. 30% go out of business within 2 years, and 50% go out of business within 5 years. So we see that it's very, very challenging to succeed as an entrepreneur in Canada. And so when you're an immigrant entrepreneur and you come to our country, and again, you have maybe language troubles, you have trouble understanding our legal and regulatory environment, you don't have a lot of business connections or friends, it becomes an even greater challenge. And so from a policymaker's perspective, the biggest question that they ask is what selection criteria will best predict an immigrant entrepreneur's success in Canada? And so they ask themselves, should we focus selection criteria on human capital, so age, language, etc.? Should we focus it on a person's business success in their home country, knowing that Canada's business environment is completely different from what it is in countries such as Iran, China, India? Or should we look at the person's ideas? If they have a great idea, regardless of their background, should we give them a chance in Canada? So these are questions that are often asked across Canada from coast to coast to coast. Another challenge is the burden of monitoring entrepreneur programs. So like I said at the beginning of this presentation, oftentimes an immigrant entrepreneur will be selected with a temporary visa or with conditional permanent residence. And so what this means from a government's perspective is you have to follow up with the individual every so often to see that they're actually engaging in their business, which costs time, money, and effort. And all of this is subsidized by the Canadian taxpayer, as well as the application fees paid by immigrant entrepreneurs. But it's a lot of work, and so that's a challenge from the government's perspective. Business immigration programs have had various fraud and misrepresentation issues over the years. So a common one has been that an immigrant entrepreneur would arrive to Canada under a provincial nominee program, which gave them unconditional permanent residence. And so they would arrive here, and once they got unconditional permanent residence, oftentimes A, they wouldn't even bother to start a business, or B, they'd be selected by a certain province and then move to the actual province that they wanted to reside in. And so that has been a common form of fraud and also misrepresentation of one's landing intentions. Regionalization has long been a challenge in Canada, and this refers to ensuring that immigrants are distributed across our country so that as many communities in Canada benefit from immigration. And so this was one of the main impetuses of the provincial nominee program, to allow provinces to select immigrants in the hopes that they will be able to boost their immigration numbers. And I think we can all agree the provincial nominee program has been very successful in this regard. But with business immigration, the long-standing challenge has been that immigrant entrepreneurs and investors have landed in Toronto, Montreal, or Vancouver, and other provinces and territories have not been able to attract many of them. And I would say this continues to remain a significant issue. Low retention rates has been a challenge. So again, immigrant entrepreneurs and investors, they'll say that, hey, I'm going to be settling in a certain province, and then as soon as they arrive to Canada, they've gone somewhere else, which has been a significant issue. With regard to low interest rates, The issue here is that, again, immigrant investor programs are structured in a way that an immigrant will provide a loan to the government. The government will take that loan, use it to support economic development, and after 5 years, they'll return the loan to the immigrant. Well, the challenge is that over the last 10 years, Canada and the rest of the world have seen some of the lowest interest rates in history, maybe the lowest interest rates in history. And so from a Canadian government's perspective, the challenge has been that, hey, I'm getting this $800,000 loan and I have to return it in 5 years. And if I use this money and it doesn't return a yield to the government, then I'm going to take a loss and I'm on the hook for returning the loan to the immigrant investor after 5 years. And so what we've seen in Canada, unfortunately, which has hurt the economic benefit of immigrant investor programs, is governments, because they're worried about losing money because of low interest rates, they've just parked the loans in the bank. After 5 years, they've returned the loans. And so we haven't seen the money being used to support infrastructure, SMEs, etc., to the extent that all of us desire. Now, with regard to public concerns, there's many public opinion issues with regards to business immigration programs. Commonly, in cities like Toronto and Montreal, or Toronto and Vancouver, there's a concern that immigrant investors are driving up real estate prices. We had someone at our conference in December present on this, an economist, who said that based on his studies, there is some impact of immigrant investors on housing prices in Vancouver, but he says the impact is not big enough to account for the huge increases in housing prices in that city. But nonetheless, there is the concern about this issue. And then you have other public concerns, such as fraud and such as the notion that Canada sells citizenship through business immigration. And then going back to my first point on this slide, one of the reasons why immigrant entrepreneurs have struggled to do well in Canada is due to the lack of dedicated entrepreneur supports available to them. And so that's something that has been improved in recent times and needs to continue to be addressed in order to ensure immigrant entrepreneurs can land on their feet and succeed in Canada. So here we'll briefly look at policy options. And I just want to know, I'm not going to cover it in my presentation, but at the end of the slide deck, which I'm sure will be available online, I have an appendix of program ideas for entrepreneur and investor programs in Canada. And also in our report, which again is available on our website, we have a significant list of program ideas for entrepreneur and investor classes. So here's a first program idea that was presented by the Vice President of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business at our conference back in December. She notes through the CFIB's research that 75% of SME owners in Canada are going to retire over the next decade, which means $1 trillion in assets will exchange hands. However, a major challenge is that only half of these Canadian SME owners have succession plans. And so a new federal immigrant entrepreneur program can help fill the void and ensure Canada has a new cohort of those who will succeed retiring Canadian business owners. And so she put forward selection criteria, which again is available in our report. And so she says that we should focus on language and business experience when selecting an individual. And also, this was an idea that was proposed by several delegates at our event, that there should be a platform that's available, maybe a website, that would allow prospective immigrant entrepreneurs to connect with retiring Canadian SME owners. Once they have a deal in place, then the immigrant entrepreneur could apply for permanent residence. The federal government would review their application and decide whether to accept them into Canada. And then with respect to other issues such as appraising the value of a Canadian business and helping to facilitate the deal, there's various ways we can go about it. So we could have a government agency oversee these processes, or we could have private sector organizations such as banks or professional services firms help to facilitate the deal. Now, I said earlier that I'll talk about the startup visa. Well, the startup visa, in my opinion, is very promising, and I think others share that view. The concern that some of us have is that even though it's operated for over 4 years now, the intake has been very, very low. And even though the startup visa is designed to be a niche program, it's not designed to have a significant intake. The question is, what's stopping us from boosting our intake of startup visa immigrants? So we see up on our screen, in its first 3.5 years of operation, only 79 individuals entered Canada through the startup visa, and 45 businesses were launched. So the question is, how can we boost admissions under what I think is a promising program? And so one way we could do so is by the federal government increasing the number of designated organizations. By my count, there are about 55 in Canada today. And so by increasing the number, you have more organizations that can go out there and recruit startup visa immigrants. Another idea, and I think it's an excellent one that was provided at our event in December, is to have more data available to the federal government and also to the public to help us analyze the startup visa and to identify pain points and areas where it can be improved. And so key metrics that designated organizations could be asked to provide on an annual basis, for instance, includes the number of potential immigrant entrepreneurs they've interviewed, the number of deals they've completed, and the structure of the deal. So for instance, how much equity that the designated organization acquired in exchange for facilitating this deal, as well as the immigrant entrepreneurs' business, key metrics of the business, including the number of employees they have, the growth rate of the business in Canada, profit margins, and other key data. And so one of the main issues with the startup visa is that the onus of finding immigrants under the program falls on the designated organizations. And so it's up to them to go out into the fields, to go into India and China and other parts of the world, Europe, etc., to find an individual, see if they have a good idea, and then support them through the immigration process. And so it's a lot of work. And so one solution for this could be to have an online website in which an immigrant entrepreneur interested in coming to Canada under the startup visa would enter all of their information, just like express entry and expression of interest systems that we have under provincial nominee programs. Once the individual enters all their information, then designated organizations in Canada can go on this website, trawl through the data, and identify individuals that they want to interview and perhaps support for immigration to Canada. So those are some ideas that we can pursue to help us improve the startup visa. Now, with investor immigration, I put in bold here some of the key issues that we need to consider to ensure that it benefits Canada, and some ideas that I have and others have in order to ensure that it does so. So we need to first define our policy goals for investor immigration, and I propose that our policy goals be set up in a way that we articulate that not only do we want to attract immigrant investors who are going to provide us with capital for underfunded areas, but also B, that we want individuals who are going to bring lots of money to Canada to spend and also invest in our local economy. And the second point is pretty new, because I think since Canada launched immigrant investor programs, it's never defined this objective. Rather, the objective that it's defined has been to attract experienced business persons to Canada. But I think we should be forthright, and I think it's a fair objective for us to say, hey, we want high net worth individuals to come here who are going to spend money to boost economic growth in Canada. Now, with respect to the amount of money we want to raise under an immigrant investor program, the number of immigrants to admit, that really depends on the policy goals. So if the government says, for instance, we want to raise $10 billion a year, that would then determine the number of immigrants and the investment amount that it sets in order to achieve that financial target. Now, I referred just moments ago about underfunded areas. Well, commonly when you talk to people who are familiar with immigrant investor programs, they say that great areas that could be supported through immigrant investor funds include infrastructure, affordable housing, and venture capital, which again are economic development priorities for federal and provincial governments in Canada. Now, how to structure the investment is very tricky because of Canada's low interest rate environment. And so there's three options that are before us if we look at future immigrant investor program pathways in Canada. So the first would be similar to the current Quebec model and the old immigrant investor program model, which is that we would ask an immigrant to provide a loan to the government. It would be guaranteed, and that money would be returned to them after 5 years. But again, when interest rates are low, governments are afraid to spend the money. And so in light of interest rates being low, we have two other options we can look at. We can ask immigrant investors to provide funds which are at risk, meaning that an immigrant investor after, let's say, 5 years, could get the money back with a profit, or they can get it back with a loss, or they might lose the entire amount. So that's a second option, or a direct contribution model, which is common in other parts of the world, but might be politically sensitive in Canada. Essentially what that is it's a straight cash transaction. So an immigrant investor would provide a government in Canada with money, and they would not get that money back, and then the government could use it in any way they see fit. So in other parts of the world, for instance, an immigrant investor will make a donation of or a contribution of, let's say, $250,000 US. They don't get that money back, but in exchange they get permanent resident status or citizenship. So that's something that we could do in Canada. Again, it's politically sensitive because of concerns of Canada selling permanent resident status or citizenship. So it might not be the most feasible option given the public opinion discourse that we have in our country. Now, with respect to regionalizing investments in immigrants, I think the solution here is fairly simple and straightforward. In the late 1980s, what Canada did with the old immigrant investor program is it said if a jurisdiction attracted less than 10% of business immigrants to Canada in the previous year, their investment requirement for an immigrant investor would be lower compared with jurisdictions which attracted more than 10%. And so if an immigrant investor wanted to go to Ontario or BC, they paid more, their loan amount was higher compared with an immigrant investor, if, for instance, they wanted to go to Manitoba. And so moving forward, if Canada has a new immigrant investor program, we could structure it in a way to support regionalization objectives. So we could say, for instance, if you want to go to Manitoba, you're required to provide a loan of, let's say, $1 million. And if you want to go to Ontario, that's fine. Your loan amount is $2 million. And that way we could perhaps see more immigrant investors go to the prairie provinces and Atlantic Canada. Now, in terms of investment requirements, again, I've already touched on this, but competitive amounts globally, I would say, are between the $1 and $2 million range, and typically they're over 5 years. After 5 years, the transaction concludes and both parties go on their way. And a very, very important consideration is ensuring quick and rigorous processing. Again, in Canada, we've had a challenge with backlogs, and oftentimes an immigrant entrepreneur or investor has to wait 5+ years for their application to be processed. And so what many people say is that this hurts the competitive standing of Canada's programs, because a business immigrant may decide instead to go to another country where their application is processed much quicker. And so moving forward, we would need probably to have private sector involvement in terms of reviewing applications. That's what the government did with a previous immigrant investor program that it tried in 2015. And it's what provinces and territories currently do across Canada. And by having the private sector involved, they have the capacity and the know-how to review applications quickly. And also, by having their support in place to review the applications, we could set higher standards for our processing time. So we could say, for instance, just like Express Entry, we're going to process business immigration applications in 6 months or less, and that will help improve the competitive standing of our programs. And then with respect to public concerns, of course, we need rigorous oversight and monitoring to placate concerns that immigrants are coming here to conduct fraudulent activities or to misrepresent their intentions, or that Canada is selling citizenship. So we need to ensure that we have oversight in place so that people don't have these concerns. And also another thing that we could do moving forward is have a public awareness campaign about the benefits of business immigration to our economy. So for instance, having a website or having signs in areas that are supported by business immigrants telling the public, hey, immigrant investor funds have contributed to this new community center, which everyone in our society is enjoying. So that's those are some ideas to address public concerns. And the final issue is on how we can better support immigrant entrepreneurs so they can succeed in Canada. And actually, we have quite a bit of literature in Canada that study this issue. One presenter who's at our conference in December, who's a researcher that's studied this issue extensively, has noted that there's 3 phases to success as an immigrant entrepreneur in Canada. In phase 1, the immigrant entrepreneur comes here. They don't start a business, rather they learn, they improve their English or French skills, they develop social and professional networks, and they gain work experience. Then in phase 2, that's when they start to think about launching a business. They come up with a business plan, they write it up, they have it reviewed by professionals, and then in the 3rd phase, they go about initiating their business. And so the key takeaway here from a public policy point of view is that perhaps our immigrant entrepreneur programs in Canada are built upon a flawed premise, and that flawed premise might be that we're assuming an immigrant entrepreneur will come to Canada and succeed right away. Rather, based on the research, we may want to design our future programs in such a way that we give an immigrant entrepreneur a grace period of, let's say, 1 or 2 years for them to settle and integrate in Canada. And then after that grace period, they are then expected to launch a business. And perhaps we'll be setting them up for success by structuring our immigrant entrepreneur programs that way. And then mentorship programs are a great way of supporting immigrant entrepreneurs. We're seeing more and more of them. I list a few examples at the bottom. The Entrepreneurship Connections program was launched by a major immigrant serving organization in Toronto and the Business Development Bank of Canada. And they're looking to launch it nationally. It's a very great initiative that I suggest you look closely into if you're interested. Again, we talk about it in our report in Chapter 5. And the Fredericton Chamber of Commerce has 3 programs in place for business immigrants, which I would say are among the best practices in our country. And so in terms of what these programs offer, if we go back to the second bullet, mentorship programs, that's essentially what they do. They provide mentorship and guidance to an immigrant entrepreneur before they start their business. So this includes in-class instructor, this includes developing know-how about the Canadian business climate and the market, learning about the legal and regulatory environment, and support in terms of writing a business plan, which is extremely important because when you think about it, oftentimes for an immigrant entrepreneur to get a loan, they need to take that business plan to a bank. And if that business plan is poorly written, maybe it's not written in fluent English or French, or there's some holes in the logic, for instance, a bank may be propensed to reject it. And so by having support in writing a business plan, you will increase your odds of securing a loan. And then other important supports include having a service provider organizations, so settlement organizations, as well as other important professionals such as lawyers, fellow entrepreneurs, those with marketing backgrounds, and other business persons sit down with an immigrant entrepreneur, hold their hand through the process, and provide them with guidance throughout their journey as entrepreneurs in our country. And so by having these supports in place, we are putting immigrant entrepreneurs on the path to success. So those are some of the policy options that we can pursue moving forward. Again, the report is available on our website. Please feel free to follow us on Twitter. I'm always available via email. My email is on the screen. But other than that, thank you for your time, and I look forward to answering any questions.
All right. If you have any questions, please type them in the question and answer section, and we will direct them over to Kareem. So Kareem, we have our first question, and it's from Dan Fontaine. So he says he would like to agree that net population loss provinces like Manitoba need to have a stronger immigration policies and programs. What can the province and larger municipalities do to tap into immigration opportunities?
So I would say that actually the provinces are doing an excellent job, especially Manitoba. Manitoba is one of the most successful provinces in Canada in terms of attracting immigrants and supporting them. With respect to business immigration, I think it's an area that we're just going to have to continue to engage in trial and error in, because it's very, very difficult for a Canadian to succeed as an entrepreneur, and so it's even more difficult as a business immigrant. But I want to go back to my earlier point about our program model in Canada, and I think that's something we might want to study and consider more closely moving forward. Our program models are structured in a way that an immigrant entrepreneur is expected to launch a business right away, but rather maybe we should structure our program so that an immigrant entrepreneur has 1 or 2 years of experience in Canada. They gain business supports, which the province of Manitoba offers, by the way, to its immigrant entrepreneurs. And then after the individual gains the supports, then they're expected to launch a business, and that way they can become more successful.
All right, thank you so much. And another question from Dan as well is, in your opinion, what is the best way to target high net worth and high skill immigrants to Manitoba?
So this is an excellent question, and I think right now the challenge from a provincial perspective is under Canada's Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, Section 87. The provinces and territories, except for Quebec, are not allowed to offer immigrant investor programs. And this was introduced at a time when the federal immigrant investor program operated. So there's basically 2 options moving forward. We could launch a new federal immigrant investor program with a tiered investment requirements, so smaller provinces such as Manitoba would have a lower threshold, and that way they become more enticing to prospective high net worth immigrants. Or a second option would be to change that part of the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act and allow provinces such as Manitoba under the provincial nominee programs to have immigrant investor streams, and that way they could be more open to immigrant investors.
All right, thank you. Participants, if you have questions, please type them in the question and answer box, and we will direct them over to Kareem. So Kareem, listening to your presentation, I would like to ask you a question. In your presentation, you outlined selection criteria will be on business, which is the human capital, and you outline its experience and language. Now, I want to know, do you think cultural differences in business experience impact is one of the challenges that investors will face when they move into Canada? And if we should put this in a rural context, do you think this will have a negative impact on rural economies?
So you say you're asking if there's a cultural context with respect to immigrant investors, if there's... So the data is very clear in Canada that immigrant investors historically have gone to Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver. In fact, the latest report that we saw from the federal government in 2014 showed that 96% were going to those 3 provinces, Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia. So very few were going to the small communities. And the reasons for that are that immigrant investors, they're looking for fellow immigrants, so populations or areas with significant immigrant populations. And then also, they're looking for school options for their kids and, maybe business opportunities. So to attract them to rural communities and whatnot, you would need to add additional policy levers like I outlined in the previous question, giving the provinces perhaps powers to select immigrant investors, or having a federal program with different investment requirements so that it might be more appealing for an individual to go to Manitoba or to a rural community compared with Ontario, where it would be more expensive and, perhaps they're not interested in living in a more crowded city or whatnot. So we'd have to look at the policy levers. And before the policy levers, we really have to define our goals, right? So if we say, hey, we want more immigrant investors in rural communities, then we would have to, if that's the goal, then it would make our lives easier in terms of developing solutions that would allow us to achieve those goals.
All right, thank you. Participants, if you have any other questions, please type them in the question and answer box, and I will direct them over to Kareem. And if there are no questions, we would just like to wrap up today's presentation. And I would like to thank you, Kareem, for your time. Thank you for such an informative presentation today. It was really enlightening, and we look forward to posting this video on YouTube where it could reach more people. And if they have any questions, they will for sure direct them over to you, as you provided your email for that. Also, at the end of this presentation, you'll be sent a survey, which we are asking you to fill out and let us hear about your feedback and any ways we can improve our webinar series. Thank you so much for joining us, and see you again next time when we are going to be focusing on a series of Northern community webinars. Thank you again, Kareem.
Thank you. Have a great day. Take care. Bye.
Take care. Bye.